Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode here. Basically this is going to be a little bit of an off-the-cuff kind of ranting episode, just talking about a random topic off the top of my head, not any prepared notes or anything. I wasn't sure what to put out on the channel this week. I don't have like a big new album that I'm excited to talk about at the moment, and I'm kind of working on some things, but it's going to take a little bit more time to prepare them. And so I thought maybe the best thing to do is just to put out some of my thoughts that have been swirling around my head about specific topics, and hopefully you guys will appreciate and be interested in my thoughts, and you can share your own thoughts in the comment section. So this might be a little bit, all over the place, wander from topic to topic. I'll try my best to keep it interesting and to keep kind of the stream of consciousness thought that makes sense, but we'll see how it goes. A lot of this is sparked from the recent Rick Beato episode that really was interesting to me, where he talks about like modern music and why music is getting worse nowadays compared to the classic music and things like that. And I didn't want to just do a straight ahead like response video to that because there's been so many on YouTube. I felt like it was just joining the bandwagon and doing something tired that a lot of people have already done. But I've been considering for a while talking about some topics that are kind of related to that. So I thought I'd fold that into this kind of discussion, this rant, whatever you want to call it. Where I've wanted to talk about my listening habits. I want to talk about why I kind of prefer to listen to new music versus like older music, and why I think for a lot of other people it might be the reverse, which has always interested me. Just some topics about our listening habits in general as a people and how they've changed over the course of time and that kind of thing. And I think that could kind of tie into some of these topics about new music versus old music. Is new music worse now than it was back then? Or is it just our perception of it? Is it just, people coming in with a different perspective? Those are interesting topics that I think are worth exploring a little bit. So when it comes to my listening habits, I think for a lot of people, they find their favorite artists when they're younger, when they're really excited about new music, when everything they're listening to is basically a new discovery and exciting to them. Those are the bands that really speak to them and become their all-time favorites, I think, for a lot of people. Of course, everybody's different, so this isn't going to be a one-for-one for everybody, but I think for a lot of people, they tend to gravitate towards certain artists from their younger years, their teenage years, maybe their early 20s or so, where they're really into discovering music and finding bands that are exciting to them, something fresh that they haven't heard before that really sticks in their ear. And over time, people, I think, fade out and don't really follow that much of new music anymore. And I think for a lot of people, this is because things stop sounding so fresh and new anymore when you already have a wealth of musical knowledge at your fingertips and your disposal. Once you've listened to a lot of bands in the style that you prefer, every new band that you start to look into, you start to compare them to the bands you already know and listen to. Like, oh, well, this just sounds like Yes, this just sounds like Rush, this just sounds like the Beatles, whatever the case may be. And you tend to want to prefer the band that excited you first because that, they did it the best in your mind because that was more exciting when you first heard that band. And I think it's all a perception thing because every band takes cues and influence from previous bands that came before them. So for me, when I was discovering prog music, I was listening to bands like the Flower Kings, like Spock's Beard, like Dream Theater. And for my ears, those were new bands, new sounds, things that I hadn't heard of before. Where older listeners who had already been entrenched into the prog scene at the time, or who loved the prog music in the 70s and into the 80s, probably heard those bands and were more like, well, this sounds like that band, this sounds like that band, and they started to compare it. And I think when your mind starts making those comparisons, it's just a natural thought to be like, well, the original band is more original. They did it first, so they obviously did it better, and this band's just kind of a copycat and just, doing the same thing over again without any new, fresh, original ideas. But I think it often is the perspective of the listener more so than the artist itself, because you could probably make similar arguments about Yes and Pink Floyd and Genesis and those bands. Back in the day, there was probably comparisons made to, well, they sound kind of like this band and that band and that. And there's probably some objective truth to, over time, as more music is established in the world, that people do take more cues from their past and do insert more influences, and music probably as a consequence is getting less fresh and innovative because a lot of it has just already been done. And so nowadays it's a little bit more about like, well, what can we mix and mold and turn into something a little bit different, because it's taking this element and fusing them together in a different way instead of just doing something wholly original on its own. But I think that's always been the case, even back with those older bands in like the 60s, 70s, is they were trying to take different styles of music that they liked, different bands they enjoyed, and fusing and doing it in a new context, adding different styles to the equation and bringing something that sounded a bit fresher and more new and nuanced. But I think the part of this discussion that often gets ignored is I think it is a lot of times based upon the listener themselves. Like for me, without that context, thought that the Flower Kings had a pretty new, fresh, original sound, and the Spock's Beard as well and stuff. I didn't really catch on to the cues of what bands they were trying to emulate or trying to be inspired from. And so I think that made me fall in love with those bands, because for my fresh young ears, that was new, exciting music to me that I could really get into and not have the baggage of like, well, it just sounds like a copy of this, sounds like a mixture of that, and that band already did it better in the past, so what's the point of this? And I think that really helped me to appreciate the modern prog scene a little bit more. And then I kind of dove backwards into the bands that kind of inspired the bands that I was loving in the modern scene. So kind of a backwards approach to, I'm sure, what a lot of people did who loved prog back in the 70s and were kind of exploring these newer bands that sounded like the bands they loved back then. For me, it was more like an exploration backwards into what bands inspired the bands I was loving in the modern era, and I think that's kind of an interesting, different style approach, and why I tend to prefer the modern bands oftentimes to the classic prog bands. As much as I respect and admire and adore them, I think you tend to latch on to what you first heard, what first, struck you as something really fresh, new, exciting, and the music itself may not have been fresh, new, and exciting, but it was for you because it was the first time you heard music like that. And so to your ears, there was something really special and fun and magical about it that isn't really replicated when you're hearing something that sounds similar to it later. It doesn't bring about those same surprising, exciting kind of feelings that the music did originally. So I just find that fascinating, because I think people often mistake that, newer music sucks because it was already done better back in this era. And I think it's just because a lot of those listeners are not listening to it with fresh new ears like a younger audience may be able to. So they're not really that excited by it because they're just thinking about what it's like and how they like that other stuff better. And so I think that's just an interesting thought experiment. And of course, when talking about Rick Beato's thesis about why music isn't as good now and why it was better in kind of the classic era, which he makes some points that, maybe he has some points to be made there about like kind of the technological advances and how people had to have more talent back in the day. And so I think it inspired people to make better music, whereas now maybe the technology is allowing us to not put as much of our own personal stake into the music. We're not putting as much of our creativity and interest into the music that comes out, the mainstream music. But I think a lot of it is more so about like the music business and them trying to push certain kinds of music, and about listeners in general, like the general public who listen to music more casually nowadays, or don't really, maybe listen to something on TikTok or listen to something on a Spotify playlist and don't really connect with music in the same fashion as what used to be done back in the 70s or whatever. But what I want to say more than anything else, kind of stepping around this whole Rick Beato situation, is there's a lot of fascinating, amazing modern music that's being made. And that's basically the premise of my entire channel, is that I'm trying to showcase like incredible modern music that's underground, that isn't the popular mainstream, but bands that have incredible talent, incredible skill, and great ear for melody and songwriting, and are making fantastic music today that to me rivals what came out in the 70s. Maybe it doesn't sound as fresh to a lot of people, like I said, because of this effect of like, well, you heard Yes, Genesis, Jethro Tull, those bands first, so they sound the most fresh and exciting and interesting, but those bands had their own wealth of influences they were drawing from. So I think that's just what bands do, is they take from the past and try to blend it and bring it into a new era and put their own stamp on it. And I think a lot of the modern artists are doing that fantastically well. And the music business has just kind of changed. Like, there's more music than ever before. You know, people are able to release music, and I think it's actually good that the technology is such that it allows more people to be able to create and innovate and put out new music. It does make it difficult for us, the listeners, to sift through all that's coming out, because there's just so many releases to look at, and you have to kind of sift through a lot of mediocre stuff to try to find the little hidden gems out there, which is basically my whole experience. Is I spend a lot of time listening to a lot of different things to try to pick out the hidden gems that I think are great and bring them to your attention if you have similar taste in music as me. And it's a fun process, but sometimes I worry that, like, I don't spend enough time with the old established favorites, with my, you know, classic records that I enjoy and love, and instead I'm just trying to chase the new big artist and just spending a lot of my time sampling and listening to things here and there. And sometimes it's hard to really just sit and listen to an album without like thinking, well, I want to discover the next best album that I can share with people on the channel. And that dictates my listening habits as well, of like, what do I want to focus on the channel? So sometimes I'll sit and listen to a bunch of new albums just because I want to pick out and find the ones that I want to talk to my audience about. And that maybe detracts from spending more time with the records I'm actually already in love with, you know, trying to chase and find the new best album, the new best band. But when you find that new band, when you find that new album that really strikes you and becomes one of your new modern favorites, to me that's an exciting feeling that never goes away. And I think that's what makes me and maybe a lot of you guys different than kind of the general public who loved music back when they were teenagers and young and music was still fresh, exciting, and new. And have kind of fallen away from it because every subsequent band they found just sounds like a carbon copy of the bands they loved when they were younger. So they kind of lose that adventurous spirit and don't really care to find more new bands. They already have their bands, and they're fine with just sticking with that you know, school of music that they've already developed. But I'm always, you know, my brain's wired a bit different because I'm always wanting to find the new best band. I'm always open to new, fresh ideas and bands that do cool, new, modern music, even if it does take its cues from a lot of my established artists that I love. I think it's fun to see a band take different styles and meld them together, or take Yes music but bring it into a more modern production style, or meld it with maybe some metal music or jazz music. You know, there's a lot of different combinations that can be done, and a lot of different ways that people can put their own stamp on the music as well. So I don't think modern music is worse necessarily. Maybe the mainstream pop world, you know, the stuff that the music industry is trying to push, you know, the Spotify charts, the, you know, whatever, if there's still Billboard Hot 100 or whatever, you know, that stuff maybe is getting worse in general. It's hard to say. You know, it could just be that younger listeners prefer a different style of music that doesn't connect with us that like more organic sounding music, that likes more, you know, rock bands that actually play their instruments rather than more electronic or rap music or whatever. You know, it may just be a source of preference rather than the quality of these releases. But regardless, what's great about the modern era is that there's so much to discover if you're just willing to put a little bit of effort to dive a bit deeper under that surface. You know, pretty much in any genre that you could think of, any indie, you know, pop, indie, different genres, you could find great music in that genre because there's so much being produced, so much music that's being released out there. But you might have to like sift through a lot of less good stuff to get to the meat, to get to the hidden gems in the pile. And sometimes that process can be a bit frustrating. Like this morning, I spent like 2 or 3 hours listening to new music. And if someone asked me what new music, you know, what music did you listen to this morning, I couldn't really tell you because I was just sampling this, that, and the other, listening to a song here, a song there, trying to find like something that sparked my interest that I was willing to dive deeper into to see if it was worth featuring. And you come away from that just hollow, like you didn't really do anything significant. Like I couldn't tell you any songs that I really latched onto and listened to this morning. It was more just sampling here and there, which I think we do a lot in the streaming age with like movies and TV as well, where you spend more time sifting through your Netflix list and deciding what you might be interested in watching than actually even watching said shows, you know. So I think that's kind of our world that we live in, that we're always chasing the next high. We're always looking for the next best thing and not just willing to settle into what already is there, that we already love and that already exists, and just taking that time with it. It's always like go, 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 you know. It's kind of like that instant gratification of wanting to find the next thing. And, you know, this society that is on their phones scrolling constantly but never stopping on anything, you know. Sometimes I feel like my music listening can be like that, and I need to step back a little bit and say, what am I doing with my life? You know, is it worth it to just waste several hours just scrolling through Spotify, Apple Music, different progressive rock, you know, websites for new music, but not actually sitting with the albums that I actually care and love? So that's, you know, a lot of random thoughts there, a lot of different topics covered about my listening habits, about new music versus old music, about people's tastes over time, that kind of stuff. But these are topics that I've been interested in, and hopefully it made some kind of rambling sense. If any of these topics are interesting to you and you want to comment on it below, please do. I'm not trying to attack anyone. Everyone's allowed to listen to music the way they want, and if you prefer to just sit in your classic 70s music and only listen to that, I think that's perfectly acceptable and great. And for your ears, that may be the premium music, and nothing today really measures up to it for your own perspective. But I think a lot of people, one of the biggest problems in general of anything is that people forget that their opinions aren't the gospel, you know, that their opinions aren't the absolute truth, that what might be true for you might not be true for someone else who listens to music in a different fashion, who feels differently about modern music. And I feel like it's kind of an unfair generalization to just say, well, modern music sucks, older music is better, as a premise, because I think it's subjective and depends upon the listener. And I tend to prefer modern music, if I'm being absolutely honest with myself, even though I have respect and love for the old classics also. So that's my thoughts. Mainstream music to me hasn't ever really been the greatest kind of music. I think it's always been better when you dig a little bit beneath the surface and look in the underground and find those hidden gems. I think it was true back in the 70s and 60s, and I think it's true now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this rant, and let me know in the comments how you feel. So thank you guys, and I'll catch you in a future episode. Bye, everybody.